The mine entrance protrudes from the rock face like a gaping mouth. The rail tracks are a shambles, and the water splashing on my feet is freezing. It is time to go inside. It is dark in here, and an odd smell taints the air. But the righteous were undeterred by cowardly superstition, and had delved fearlessly into the earth to extract the ore. By the miracle of the foundry and the forge, let the higher things be wrought. It had made sense to build the factory underground as well. Most of it had been destroyed when the trickster caused an earthquake, but certain areas, now inaccessible, had withstood the collapse. Years later, a reckless and arrogant priest undertook to open the tomb. His intention was to pray for the souls of his brothers who hadn't made it out. Laborers dug back down into the section of factory that was still intact, and then all of a sudden, they had all fled. Something had made them panic. I follow along with the priest and his foreman as we descend into the mines. Scattered all around us are discarded tools, loose rubble, and several rusting mine carts. To my left is a sealed door beyond which lies a disused iron shaft. I begin to feel terribly uneasy. The door is of menacing aspect. "Nay, sister, be not afraid. We are here to accomplish a great work, and the builder is with us. Here, take thee the lily in thy hand." We reach the factory wall, and a small hole in it allows us to crawl inside. We are standing on the upper walkway, and the main floor of the factory is beneath us. The foreman says that we should not go down there. The priest sings the hymns, says the prayers, and splashes holy water all over the place. Overcome by his pride in having accomplished this holy deed, he will be restrained no longer. He goes down there. The foreman is already gone. I didn't see him leave. I look over the edge of the walkway. I see the gears set into the walls. I see the foundry, the molds and the rusty hammers in rotting crates. I also see the brothers, who even now toil away unto eternity. They were already singing the hymns and reciting the prayers, though we did not have ears to hear. Our good brothers have no faces. Look! There is the priest. They've torn off his face. The new tunnel has been brought down again with great haste, sealing us in for good this time. I turn around and one of the brothers has come up behind me. He hadn't made a sound, and he doesn't have a face. Alma awoke from the strange dream with a startled jolt. Her heart was pounding and she gasped for air. It took a moment for her to steady her breathing. It had been a great relief to wake up safe in the acolytes' quarters, but this had once been a Hammerite church, and after such a dream, Alma did not find that fact particularly comforting. The chronometer on the desk indicated that she'd been asleep for just over 4 hours. If she got moving now, she'd be on time for the beginning of her shift. Sluggishly, Alma pulled herself up to a hunched sitting position. The dream had not felt like it belonged to her. It was as though memories from another life were looking back upon themselves through her eyes. Alma noticed that there was a meal tray sitting on the table. She got up from the bed and walked over to it. A note from Friend Alma commanded her to eat every bite and wished her well on her first shift. Alma gladly obeyed her colleague's order. Her sense of guilt from earlier came back renewed. Did Alma see Diurney and Lizelle as they really were, or was she judging them solely on their past deeds? Doubtless they'd both be out on the town, preaching to the people. At least that's what they were supposed to be doing. Lizelle was probably already drunk, at the crippled Burrick or some other dive. Diurney would most likely be wasting time, chatting with her former co-workers over on the docks, Whether or not they did right as mechanists, Alma could not say that her fellows weren't doing right by her. That a sinner could still be a kind person was not a fact that either Hammer or Mechanist doctrine cared to remind anybody of, and perhaps that was an oversight. After finishing her meal, Alma straightened her robes. Sleeping in them had not been a good idea, but going through the motions of undressing would have taken valuable time which she wanted to spend asleep. She dipped a towel into the porcelain water pitcher at the foot of her bunk and wet her face. She absolutely could not afford to be tired. Alma left the acolyte's quarters and headed down the hall back to the chapel. It was approaching shift change, and the friends on second shift were pushing to complete their assigned duties. Entering the chapel, Alma almost immediately caught sight of Brother Artis and Friend Fredis over by the altar. They were conferring with Friend Ashton, who had been supervising the second shift. Ashton was an ignorant and cruel bully. He had been a house guard for one of the nobles prior to joining the order. Since it would give him an excuse to commit violent deeds, potentially on large numbers of people, Friend Ashton espoused an extreme animosity towards the pagans and anyone who might be a sympathizer. He was a tall, large man with a boyish, mean face and thick arms. He radiated violence, hatred, and frustration at not possessing a victim to act upon. A war to eliminate the pagan heresy was coming. Father Karras and the High Council spoke of it often and in no uncertain terms. Secretly, Alma wanted nothing to do with it, and she prayed that genocide was not the task that the builder had chosen for her. "Ah, our factory supervisor, thou art tastefully early," Brother Artis said, motioning her to join the impromptu conference. "Now see, eager novice," said Brother Artis as he turned to Friend Fretis and pointed at her. "On time means 20 minutes early, especially when thou art a supervisor." "Yes, I see," Friend Fretis muttered. He never made eye contact. "How can you see? Thou art not even looking," Artis scowled. I didn't need to look. I knew she was there already," Fretis stammered. Brother Artis regarded Friend Fretis with a look of annoyed incredulity, and then turned back towards Friend Ashton. "Continue," Artis said with a gesture of his hand. "There be little enough to report. The area supervisors tell me that their teams hath performed acceptably this evening, and so it seemed to me when I didst make my rounds," Ashton replied. Clearly he was both tired and bored. "Personally, I think that the security detail must show more spirit. When we make war upon the pagans, we will need to be relentless and hungry for the fight. I think that in addition to their regular patrol duties, a regimen of drill and exercise," Ashton continued before being cut off by Brother Artis, "irrelevant at the present time, stay on topic. Hath thee anything else to say of tonight's routine operations?" Artis's tone was forceful and slightly raised. "As I said, brother, there be little enough to say. We did not encounter any problems. The fine details are in the logs which hath been turned in already," Ashton answered insolently. "Then I suggest that thou get back to work. My expectation is that all of thy people will have completed their assigned tasks this evening. Do a final rounds and note any shortfalls, but do not fail to dismiss thy shift on time. A spirited shift begins with a punctual start and a timely end," Brother Artis glowered. Friend Ashton nodded and turned away to do as he was bidden. Ashton feared losing his supervisory position, which would make committing atrocities far more difficult. It made Alma sick. Friend Ashton had all the means he needed to be a man of construction, but he was chomping at the bit to destroy. When he stood before the builder, Ashton would learn all about destruction, but until then, how much damage would he succeed in causing? For his part, Brother Artis was no one to mess with. He was utterly indomitable in his convictions, perfectly confident in using his authority, and the chain of command was sacred to him. Artis was short and thin, but his eyes blazed with an intensity which was not buffered by his thick eyebrows and long handlebar mustache. Of all those who sat on the High Council, he was both the most pompous and also the most boisterous. Artis took a very dim view of human nature. He was the outspoken champion of those within the order who felt that the Builder's children were destined to surpass humanity in every meaningful way. Artis only seemed to be happy when he was operating machinery or programming a difference engine. "Doth he not also have a bad attitude? Why then doth everyone pass judgment on me alone?" Friend Fredis said with sullen indignation. "Ah, eager novice speaks up. And for what? To defend thine own indefensible performance by calling out the shortcomings of others," Brother Artis sardonically replied. "The difference between that man and thee, eager novice, is that he hath just now truthfully reported to me that nothing went wrong on his shift. I know that he is telling the truth because I hath already done mine own inspection, and indeed everything is proceeding acceptably. Whereas, how many times didst you report that all was well at shift's end and sign paperwork to that effect, only for us to discover almost immediately that we didst have several disasters in progress?" Brother Artis raised an eyebrow at Friend Fredis. "Indeed, it's just," Fredis gestured with agitation, trying to find the words for whatever thought he was trying to express. "It's just what?" Brother Artis barked. "Nothing. Never mind," Fredis huffed. "I'll mind as much as I deem necessary. Thou must be kept constantly in mind, eager novice," Artis said, turning to Alma. "I regret to inform thee, Friend Hobart, that we will be coming down to visit thee later tonight. Eager Novice and I here will be reviewing every facet of shift operations. Additionally, since there is an obvious deficit in his skill base, I think that Eager Novice shall also try his hand at crafting a small object tonight. Of course, I will be at his side at all times, and I shall answer to thee for any mishaps." "That will be fine, brother. Pray thee do come and find me when you arrive. I wouldst be glad to help in any way I can," Alma said. "Of course thou will. Thou possesses the proper attitude for a leader," Brother Artis said, taking a step closer to her. He glared at her. His smile stretched a mile wide, and his eyes were on fire. It made Alma instantly uncomfortable. "And it was good to see this morning that thy loyalties are fully focused upon Lord Caris, where they belong." A moment of quick thinking struck her, and without hesitating, Alma made a simple reply. "I will not fail Lord Caris or the Builder." "Indeed. Proceed to the factory. We shan't detain thee any longer. Come along, eager novice. We make haste for the North Tower conference room." The intense gaze fell from Brother Artis's face, and he made an abrupt turn and headed off, with Friend Fredis following glumly behind. "So, he knows something of the plans that Lord Caris and the Builder have made for me," Alma thought. Alma did not like the fact that Brother Artis knew something that she did not. While Ortham, Theodoric, and Vilnia had taken exception to Alma addressing her vow directly to Lord Caris during her ordination, Artis had apparently approved. He seemed to see something promising in her. One thing was all but certain. The High Council was divided on the matter. And anyway, they were probably fighting again, about who knew how many issues. All who sat on the High Council had thrown in their lots with Lord Caris, and there was no going back. The Order's leaders needed its protection more than anyone. The Hammers would love to throw all of them into Crag's Cleft prison for heresy. That did not mean that everyone on the council always saw eye to eye, neither on the day-to-day management of the Order, nor on major decisions. And with the High Council, it regularly went well beyond simple disagreement. Recently, a major dispute had erupted over how best to handle the goods and equipment that some of the noble houses were donating. This had expanded into a finger-pointing brawl over the order's finances generally. It had been a highly visible, embarrassing, and bitter conflict. Father Karras had tried to lead with a calm hand, but when several council members began recruiting cronies from among the priesthood, he became enraged. He brought everyone together, council member, priest, and acolyte. Anyone who had taken one side or the other too strongly had been summoned to that meeting. Alma had no idea what Lord Karras had said or done, but several acolytes and priests left the order immediately. Those who survived didn't speak about it, but had certainly been changed. On the surface, they were grateful for having been corrected by their master, but Alma could not miss the symptoms of trauma in their subsequent behavior. For their part, the High Council had been far more careful and low-key about how they handled their disagreements afterwards. Of course, Lord Karras's wrath could be terrible, but they had forced him to it. There were two opposing factions with the High Council, with a few members caught in between. On one side were those who saw the Mechanist Order as nothing more than an extension of Lord Karras's will, a tool for his use. This included Brother Cavador, Brother Fegan, and Brother Artis. Brother Cavador was the oldest member of the High Council, slightly older than Lord Karras himself. He was also the only member of the entire order with enough intelligence, skill, and inspiration to work with Lord Karras as an actual colleague. No one else possessed nearly the same ability to comprehend Lord Karras's designs or to assist in solving the problems of manufacturing them. Brother Cavador was the only man that Lord Karras ever consulted with regarding engineering problems or theoretical questions. The mysterious Brother Fegan served as Father Karras's secretary and was his closest spiritual disciple. Fegan had a great amount of control over who and when anyone got to see Father Karras. He was always present in the antechamber of Father Karras's apartment, but was almost never seen anywhere else. He was quiet and starry-eyed. Most people assumed that this was because of the deep mysteries that Father Karras was allegedly instructing him in. Alma was uncertain about how intelligent Brother Fegan actually was, but without a doubt he was the closest thing to a son that Father Karras would ever have. He was by far the youngest member of the High Council. Then on the other side were brothers Ortham and Theodoric, with some inconsistent support from Brother Trickspring. These old hammers were ecclesiastics through and through. They saw the Mechanist Order as a reformed church, as a religion. They served the builder first and Lord Karras second. Brother Ortham wanted to save the righteous and destroy the wicked. Beyond sitting on the council, Brother Ortham was in charge of training and teaching within the order. Brother Theodoric was perpetually obsessed about establishing and refining the legal framework to justify and explain those goals. Everything they did or thought, they did so ecumenically. They were also settled monastics, though they did believe in reaching out to the laity. They wished to draw the larger society into a tight orbit around the Mechanist Order. Father Karras's decision to hold back on proselytizing to the commoners for the time being had not sat well with them. Brother Trickspring tended to agree with Ortham and Theodoric on just about everything, but first as a hammer master forger, and now as a mechanist. Trickspring was responsible for supervising the chapels located in the homes of the nobles and throughout the city, as well as the clergy assigned to them. This complicated his relationship with Ortham and Theodoric. Father Karras took a close interest in the nobles and the order's important relationships with them. Trickspring could not afford to differ with Father Karras, but he did not understand any of the innovations or reforms that separated the Mechanists from the Hammerites. He had joined with Father Karras only because the other master forgers had been making his job extremely difficult, and it had made him angry. He was almost never present, since he maintained a constant circuit from one chapel to the next. He was unpopular, but Karras considered his close rapport with the nobles an indispensable necessity. Friend Capezza was a lay inventor who had been offered membership in the order and a seat on the High Council for one reason only. He had invented several components which had completed the final design of the builder's children. He took no interest in the council's disagreements, nor in anything else save his work. And lastly, there was friend Vilnia. Alma did not envy her. Vilnia served the order as its chief of operations. It was her job to keep the gears turning smoothly, even as the council argued back and forth over what the priorities were. Father Karras expected Vilnia to walk that line, but he did almost nothing to help her. She was a strong woman, a fighter, but lately she was being pushed to the limit. Alma stood by Father Karras, and she was glad that he had made it clear to everyone that there were no sides to take. They owed everything to him. She agreed that the order should reach out to the people and change the world for the better. Had not the order reached out to her and her family? At the same time, Alma did not want to see the Mechanists become corrupted by their dealings with the world. She hoped that the festering issues would be disposed of sooner rather than later. These disagreements were standing in the way of progress, and there was so much work to be done. And with that thought, Alma headed back through the chapel exit, down the seminary's main hall, and then began her descent to the factory by way of a crammed staircase. The stairs were narrow. The rough old stones that the hammers had set long ago were becoming loose in their mortar. Alma had to crouch low to avoid banging her head, again, on the low ceiling of the stairwell as she headed further downward. The noise from the factory grew louder and louder. At the bottom of the stairs, Alma was temporarily dazzled, as usual, by the overly bright bluish-white glare of the gas lamp. There was no point in turning the knob down a bit. After 1 hour, the timing springs would turn it back up to a full burn. The tunnel leading into the factory was a disaster waiting to happen in the event of an emergency evacuation. Alma stopped in front of the hardened iron door leading into the old Hammerite crypts. Were it up to her, that door would be welded shut, and a new wall of stone would be put up in front of it. The threat would be eliminated and taken out of sight. Eventually, perhaps the crypts would even be forgotten. Alma prayed that, from on high, the master builder would pound his fist against the ground and cause those catacombs to collapse in on themselves. Alma noticed that she seemed to be hearing something. The sound was faint. Alma thought she heard several voices. They were singing. Alma turned away from the awful door and headed through the small arch into Factory Bay 1. Friend Gretchen and her security detail were waiting for her. "Attention!" Gretchen yelled, and her squad snapped to it. "Nay, relax, 'tis unnecessary." Alma waved her hand gently. The other members of the team relaxed immediately, but friend Gretchen stood rigid. "We hath already completed our first rounds, friend," Gretchen said with a proud smile. "The factory is secure, and we shall not fail to keep it so." "I thank thee much. But what about upstairs? The second shift security detail will surely be impatient for relief," Alma said. "Nay, friend, our orders come from Lord Karras himself. He hath commanded that a full security team shall remain with thee. I mean, down here in the factory for the duration of the shift. Other arrangements hath been made for the rest of the seminary, and a child of Karras doth walk the perimeter." Friend Gretchen was trying desperately to move past the obvious slip-up. "I see," Alma replied, looking over Gretchen's shoulder at the squad she'd assembled. The team was composed of some of the Order's most experienced, proven friends at arms. Friend Gorick had been a soldier in the Baron's army until a little over a year ago. Alma had heard a rumor that he'd been discharged for violating the rules of war, or at least bending them too far for comfort. He had just achieved the rank of elevated acolyte earlier in the month, but he'd forgotten more about soldiering and combat than most friends at arms were ever likely to learn. A scarred beast of a man, Gorick was nevertheless soft-spoken, and he was always in a calm, serene mood. The aura of violence remained. It never went away. But somehow Alma trusted him. Friend Coltis had been a plumber with the city public works department. While still a layman, he had started attending services and become inspired. It had been necessary to severely curtail his training. He could barely read and could simply not grasp the theological subtleties. The job of being the order's plumber did not as yet keep him busy all the time, so he doubled as a friend-at-arms, which was the only other task he could handle. He was incredibly strong, surprisingly fast, and he never slept. Though large around the waist, he was as agile as he was strong. So far, he seemed virtually immune to either pain or fear. Friend Manus was the smart one, an intellectual. He had fallen on hard times prior to joining the order. Some claimed that he'd become a mechanist just to stay out of the poorhouse, but he seemed to possess many genuinely good qualities. Nevertheless, Manus had not yet excelled at anything in particular, so a humble foot soldier he remained. His chief strength lay in the fact that he was always paying attention. He had distinguished himself by single-handedly detecting and foiling a Hammerite ambush that had targeted a group of friends who were ferrying an important shipment of crates from Eastport Seminary to Angel Watch. In a fight, he performed well under pressure. Friend Gretchen was a large, barrel-chested woman. Her face and body were not dainty. While on duty, she was as diligent as a chronometer. It was true that she was as eager for a fight as Ashton, but she was a kind, honest woman with a joyful smile and a heart of gold. She was very religious, but stubbornly refused to study any subject which she deemed useless. Gretchen was a foreigner, who had only been in the city for 10 years. She'd come from the northeast, and her life in those lawless regions had been almost that of a savage. She tended to prefer the company of men, and some of the women in the order had whispered that her inclinations went against nature. Alma had reminded several sisters that the question was categorically irrelevant. Gretchen, Coltis, Gorick, and Manus all wielded the standard Mechanist mace, a large pole arm with the heavy crossed gears on the business end. The squad's crossbow was carried by friend Sabine. Sabine had the distinction of being the order's best shot. She never missed. Alma had watched a practice session where friend Sabine had told several male friends to push her around while she took aim. It had made no difference. Her shots always found their mark. Some worried that it was witchcraft, but such mutterings were disregarded. Sabine was so lethal that she was considered a major tactical asset. She was not a pleasant person. She had killed several pagans on the streets and was proud of it. Sabine often waxed lyrical about the unimaginable pain of being hit in the gut by one of her bolts. She doted on her crossbow as though it were a child. Alma suspected that, like so many other friends, Sabine was a damaged person with a broken past. "Very well, be about thy duties. I shall take updates from thee every hour. Dismissed." Alma nodded at friend Gretchen. "Yes, friend, off we go. All right, Mechanists, move out." Gretchen and her team headed across Factory Bay 1 towards Bay 2. Alma looked at the workbench which ran along the north wall. Here was the final assembly for the watchers and sentries. The bench was a disaster area, and that annoyed Alma profusely. Someone had even had the audacity to leave the head of a small child of Karis on the bench as though it were mere clutter. Tools were scattered about all over the place. This would have to be cleaned up before Brother Artis arrived, and Alma should not have had to do it. She turned to the corner where the supervisor's office was located. Upon entering, she found it unoccupied. While she'd been busy reviewing the security team, Alma had not noticed friend Senwith slip away without a proper pass-down, or even a nuts to you, Taffer. After setting the workbench aright, Alma flagged down one of the factory workers and ordered him to return the head of the Child of Karis back to Factory Bay 4. Alma returned to the supervisor's office, which was an even greater disaster than the workbench. The table was buried under a mess of schematics, reports, lists, plans, and memos. The supervisors weren't cleaning up after themselves. They just ran their shift on top of the last person's mess and then dug until they found what they needed. The bookshelves and the small workbench opposite the desk were in even worse shape. After giving it a try, Alma realized that her efforts to put the office in order were all in vain. Then, over the thudding and hum of the factory, she heard Brother Artis and Friend Fredis coming into Factory Bay 1. Alma charged out of the office to meet them. Fredis looked like he'd been crying. Brother Artis had his toolbox in one hand and a diagram of a simple, single-phase switch box in the other. "Don't mind us, friend. Childish Novice and I shall be setting up our project over there on the workbench. How goes the shift?" The workbench and the supervisor's office were inexcusable messes when first I came on duty, and the office still is, Alma began. Before she could speak up again, they caught sight of Friend Manus running towards them at top speed. By the time he reached them, he was totally out of breath. As he set the head of his mace on the ground, Alma noticed that his hands were shaking. "We've got a problem. There hath been..." Friend Manus's throat seemed to close on his words. "Well, out with it, man! Don't just stand there like a quadruped! What hath there been?" Brother Artis demanded. From around the corner, a large group of the friends who had been assigned to the factory came running. Their faces were all sheer panic. Alma counted 9 of the 10 people who had reported for duty. Without any pause or explanation, 3 of them ran across the bay, through the archway, and up the stairs. The other 4 huddled together against the wall opposite the workbench, using the flywheel array for cover. The count was incomplete. Where was her 10th friend? Friends Gretchen, Coltus, and Sabine had followed behind the fleeing workers and paused at the archway leading into Factory Bay 2. Friend Gretchen looked over at them expectantly, waiting for instructions. "Well, someone speak up! What hath transpired here?" Artis yelled. "Friend Jorel hath been injured," Manus began. "He and Friend Halesse were at work in the mold room. Halesse said that 3 stones didst break loose from their mortar, and then didst fall to the ground, all on their own. Friend Jorel looked through the hole, and then he didst reach in. Then, all at once, in the name of the Master Builder, how stupid can one be?" Artis began. "Stay here and hold this area," Alma said to Manus. She turned to Brother Artis. "Brother, I suggest that you..." "Under no circumstances am I going anywhere," Brother Artis cut her off. Alma turned towards the remaining workers. "The rest of you, get clear of here and arm yourselves. Then return with reinforcements. Thou wilt hold this factory bay. Nothing is to get past the archway. Do you understand?" The 4 mechanists stood where they were and looked at her like startled deer. "Move!" Alma blared at the top of her lungs. The 4 acolytes took flight, bottlenecking in the archway and practically trampling one another. With a deliberately affected look of shame, Brother Artis slowly shook his head, side to side. He maintained a restraining grip on Friend Fredis's arm. The young priest was feebly attempting to break loose and flee. Alma ran across the bay to Friend Gretchen. "Where is Gorick?" Alma yelled at Gretchen over the heightening factory noise. "He went to try and help Friend Jorel. It seems he's bleeding profusely. I took the initiative of evacuating the factory. I hoped that 'twas..." You and Sabine join Manus over at the archway and protect Brother Artis. But under no circumstances is anything to get upstairs. Do you understand? Alma asked, focusing her gaze straight into Gretchen's eyes. Aye, friend, Gretchen nodded. Cultus, thou art with me. Take point, I shall cover thee. Let's go, Alma commanded. I'm with thee, ma'am, Cultus exclaimed eagerly. If they're zombies, they'll be moving slow and 'twill be easy, friend Sabine said to Gretchen as they headed over to the others. But if they're, well, those are fast. Very fast. Alma and Cultus took off down Factory Bay 2, and she did her best to keep up. Her ankle-length robes were seriously slowing her down. They ran past another workbench, the coal chutes, the coils, and the capacitors. Rounding the corner into Factory Bay 3, Alma almost fell face first onto the ground, but regained her balance at the last instant. On the left wall were the difference engines which controlled most of the heavy machinery in the factory. These systems remained in operation 24 hours a day, and it was the primary task of the night shift to see to it that the automated systems functioned properly. The modest output quotas were mainly to ensure that the machines would be primed and warmed up when the day shift began. At the entrance to Factory Bay 4, where the builder's children were created, Friend Cultus abruptly stopped, got down on one knee, and began reciting the prayer of salutation. No! Alma pulled him to his feet. There's no time! As they reached the far wall of Factory Bay 4, Friend Gorick came out of the mold room, with a barely conscious Friend Jorl leaning heavily on him. Alma's stomach upturned. Friend Jorl's neck had been hideously wounded, and his uniform was drenched with his own blood. Friend Gorick had wrapped the laceration in gauze, but the dressing was saturated with blood and dripping steadily. That's a bad leak, Friend Cultus observed anxiously. Who told you to go it alone? Alma barked a question at Friend Gorick. I don't leave a wounded comrade to die. You may rely on it. Gorick yelled to be heard over the noise, but he maintained his unnatural calm. What could she say? Gorick had undoubtedly saved Friend Jorl's life for the moment. They needed to get him to the healing font, and fast. They've lost all interest in the wall. I think they're going to try the crypt door again, Gorick stated nonchalantly. Let's move out. We've got to get back up there. Cultus, help them, Alma ordered. As Gorick and Cultus dragged a limp Friend Jorl towards Factory Bay 3, Alma ran into the mold room. Sure enough, there were 3 demolished stones laying on the floor. The gaping hole in the wall opened into a yawning black abyss. The crypts were nowhere near here. Either they had been tunneling or they'd found a natural fissure. It was a miracle they hadn't broken through, but the granite stones that the Mechanists had used to build the factory wall were many times harder than cave limestone. Alma rushed out of the mold room and hurried to catch back up to the others. In the middle of Factory Bay 3, the factory noise was momentarily drowned out by a truly horrible shriek. The sound had passed through the walls, pierced the air, and penetrated into their minds. Cultus and Gorick both wailed in pain and almost dropped Friend Jorl, whose only reaction was an agonized twitch of his head. Alma's vision went black. Then she beheld a brief but terrifying vision of blasphemous violation and gleeful apostasy. Its form was impossible to describe. Magic knot of the builder swirled and ignited, poisoning the air. Fallen brethren arose in undeath, with terrifying red vapor burning off the skin of their faces. Alma managed to snap herself out of it. The vision had lasted for only an instant, but it had felt like an eternity. This ends tonight, she thought. Upon returning to Factory Bay 1, Alma was shocked to see that only 2 additional friends-at-arms had arrived. Brother Artis pointed to Friend Jorl, and they came over and took him from Gorick and Cultus. If they could get him to the healing font immediately, he would survive the surgery to close that wound. Gretchen and Manus stood poised to strike on either side of the crypt door, while Sabine stood close to Brother Artus. Friend Fredus stood in front of the crypt door with his projective hand trained upon it. Inexplicably, all trace of fear was gone from his face, and instead he was focused and ready for action. Alma motioned for Coltus and Goric to fall back in with the others. I called for reinforcements, Alma protested to Brother Artus. Well, thou art not getting them. Additional teams hath been deployed at the top of the stairs and inside the secure annex. 2 of the builder's children are in position outside of Lord Caris's chambers. He hath been alerted to the situation and has directed that the threat be neutralized. I have sent word that we hath taken the situation in hand. Here is the key. Proceed. Artus reached forward with the massive key to the crypt door and regarded Alma with an expectant stare. Alma took the key. Goric, Coltus, and Gretchen, the 3 of thee shall take point. Sabine and I shall cover thee. Manus, thou shalt prevent anything from reaching either of us, Alma ordered. Any questions? I shall also be coming along, Brother Artus said. Brother, I cannot possibly allow a member of the High Council, Alma began. I am coming. It is necessary for me to observe this engagement so that we may devise a permanent solution to this problem. I shall hold the lantern, and I have this young man here to protect me. Artus gestured at friend Fredus. With a shy smile, Fredus nodded and raised his right hand, keeping his projective left hand aimed at the door. Alma could see that he was ready, warming his pathways to spin up a gear in a hurry. What are you waiting for? She asked herself inwardly. Alma tossed the key to Gretchen and nodded. All right, good mechanists, forward. Gretchen worked the key into the lock and turned till it clicked. It took both her and friend Goric to open the door. It groaned horrendously on its rusted hinges, and several times it stuck, and they had to kick it. Dust and chips of stone flew everywhere. Once the door had been fully opened, the party proceeded into the catacombs. Gretchen, Coltus, and Goric pressed ahead, looking in all directions. Friend Sabine kept her head on a swivel, aiming her crossbow wherever her eyes went. Alma kept her right hand up and counterbalanced with her left. She scanned the dead corridors ahead of them. Regulating the temperature in her arm was proving difficult. She wanted to shoot. Steady, she told herself inwardly. Friend Manus was in position right next to her. He was breathing heavily, clenching his teeth, and his face was twitching terribly. Alma could see that he was already struggling to control his rage. That wasn't good. It was an effect of the evil they were about to face. Some people were susceptible to a sympathetic reaction. It wasn't just a matter of maintaining order in the ranks. This was spiritually unhealthy, but there was no other alternative. The passages ahead of them were the essence of decay. The walls seemed to be rotting away like dead flesh. Torch stands lay fallen on the ground or hung crooked on the wall, some by only one screw. The relief carvings on the sarcophagi were now illegible. A colony of glowworms clung indifferently from the ceiling, their scant light providing no benefit. Brother Artus kept the lantern raised, its steady light allowing for a decent view of the path ahead of them. The corridor ahead ended in a T-intersection. Arches directly opposite each other led further into the crypts. Hold here. We are watching, mechanists, very attentively. Whatever it be, call it out the moment you see it, Alma said softly. Everyone froze and waited. The air was putrid, and the smell seemed to be getting worse. Another bad sign. All right, we must get a clear view of both passages ahead. If we are flanked down here, we're finished. Goric, Coltus, on my command, be ready to move ahead and peer down those corridors. See if you can spy anything, Alma quietly ordered. Just then they heard it. Chain mail rattling upon bare bones. Hold, Alma whispered. Chamber to strike. Everyone tightened their grip on their weapons and readied their aim. The sound was maddening as it grew steadily louder, but for whatever reason, there were no eerie whispers or demonic moans. Then suddenly, the rattling stopped. Utter silence. Alma could not tell how many of them there were, but they would certainly be coming from the right. They were already close now. Very close. It was intolerable, the stillness. Alma became aware of everyone's tense breathing. Against the quiet of the tomb, their exhalations were almost deafening. Then, a bone-rattling scream pierced the silence. They all twitched and shivered involuntarily. Alma felt her arm beginning to lose heat, and she willed life into the fires, getting the temperature back up again. Another scream followed, and then another. Alma and friend Fredis manifested gears in their hands and started them spinning. Fredis did not stop once his gear reached an idling RPM. He kept accelerating it, and already the gear was practically white-hot in his hand. If he wasn't careful, he'd burn himself, but good. The hammer haunt flew through the right archway and actually jumped. It didn't make a sound as it pounced. Friend Goris had no choice but to hit the ground and roll. A lesser soldier would never have successfully executed such a maneuver. As it was, he barely missed having his skull liquefied as the haunt swung. Instead, its hammer smashed into the floor of the crypt, sending chips and splinters of stone flying everywhere. Effortlessly, the haunt freed its weapon and swung at friend Gretchen. She blocked the strike with the shaft of her mace, but the impact made it wobble. Gretchen cried out in pain, dropped to her knees, and curled into a ball, and cradled her shaking hands. Sabine fired, and her bolt struck the haunt in the left shoulder joint, ruining its arm. "Loose!" friend Fredis shouted as he fired, but the gear in his hand had melted completely. In its place, a slow stream of plasma lazily made its way across the room. If nothing else, it had almost vaporized Alma's head as it passed by. "Well, that's no good, boy. Try again," Brother Artis commanded. "Send," Alma intoned. Her gear struck the haunt squarely in its chest, knocking it backwards. Friend Cultus charged forward and with a swing of his mace decapitated the haunt. Undeterred, it kicked Cultus in his right shin. The straps of his leg bracer popped, and the dented piece of armor fell to the ground. Cultus hopped onto one foot, totally off balance. The haunt grabbed his left ankle and pulled with immense strength. "No!" Cultus cried as he toppled face first into the pavement. The impact left him dazed and temporarily out of the fight. Friend Gorix slammed into the haunt from behind, knocking it to the ground. Gorix stamped his boot onto the haunt's back. Bone and metal had melted together where Alma's gear had impacted. Gorix hurled the head of his mace down upon the spine of the haunt, breaking it in two. With a final ear-piercing scream, the animating spirit fled, and the bones went limp. Gorix frantically struggled to get his mace free from the tangle of armor and bone. A second hammer haunt flew through the left archway, going straight for friend Gorix. Before it could reach striking distance, friend Gretchen shot up from the ground and bear-hugged the haunt at the waist, trying to drag it down. The haunt recovered its footing, but lost its grip on its hammer, which went flying to the other side of the corridor. Alma spun up another gear. Friend Gorix swung, but the hammer caught his mace by the shaft and pulled with such force that Gorix flew off of his feet straight towards the ground. Amazingly, he managed to roll a second time. Friend Gretchen was gaining leverage, but then the haunt seized her by the throat with both hands. Gretchen barely got her own hands around its wrists in time to prevent it from snapping her neck. Instead, the haunt just squeezed, emitting a scream that made their ears ring even more intensely. Gretchen would be dead in seconds. "Loose!" friend Fredis exclaimed as he launched another gear. This time his shot hit the haunt squarely in the chest. It wailed and released its grip on friend Gretchen. She fell onto her knees, struggling to breathe. "Aha! Keep firing!" Brother Artis cheered as Fredis began spinning yet another gear. "Send!" Alma intoned again, launching a second projectile of her own. Her gear hit the hammer haunt in the kneecap, and its lower leg flew apart. The creature fell to its knee on one side. Friend Sabine had loaded another bolt, and now she fired. The steel bolt hit the haunt in the spine right beneath the skull, and its head went flying off. Friend Cultus was slowly and clumsily getting back to his feet. Friend Goric charged forward, and with a single blow smashed what was left of the undead menace into pieces. This time the departing scream caused everyone's hearing to fail momentarily. Suddenly, Friend Goric's eyes went wide, as though he was sensing something, and he swung around just in time to see the zombie as it punched him in the face. Goric fell over, out cold. The foul creature had slipped into the intersection unnoticed from the left side. Disarmed, Friends Cultus and Gretchen both fell upon the creature with their bare hands, trying to wrestle it to the ground. "You fools, if it bites you," Alma thought. With Gretchen and Cultus in the way, the rest of them couldn't shoot. They didn't stand a chance. That zombie was stronger than 3 grown men. It got an arm free and landed a hammer fist onto Gretchen's cheekbone. With a saddening grunt, Gretchen fell flat on the ground. Cultus continued to wrestle, trying to gain position, but was immediately overpowered. The zombie got Cultus by the wrists and forced him to his knees. It lurched its decayed head backwards, opening its rotting mouth to reveal a maw of jagged, misshapen teeth. "No," Alma screamed from within sight of herself. "No!" Friend Manus shouted. So far he had shown incredible discipline, staying with Alma and Sabine, even as he watched his friends gradually lose the battle. Now Manus flew forward in a berserk fury. Noticing him, the zombie kneed Cultus in the face, knocking him out again, and charged at Friend Manus. When they met, Manus jumped to the zombie's right side and swept with his leg. The zombie flew backward. Its feet flew high off the ground. Manus screamed hysterically at the top of his lungs. The sound was so loud that Alma's already deadened ears winced in pain. That scream was indistinguishable from a haunt's. The zombie lurched upwards, but before it could get to its feet, Manus swung his mace high overhead and brought it down with immense speed, landing a hit squarely in the zombie's face. Its head went flying off its neck and bounced off the back wall of the corridor. Manus fell to his knees, exhausted by the effort. In the quiet that followed, while Manus struggled to steady his breathing, Friend Goric tried to get to his feet, still thoroughly dazed. Friend Gretchen twitched back to consciousness, and Cultus began to moan. Friend Sabine lowered her crossbow just a bit, and Fredus evaporated the gear in his hand. The thought almost occurred to Alma that perhaps it was over. From the right, 2 round objects rolled across the floor and came to a stop just past where Friend Cultus lay. Brother Artis stepped forward with the lantern. There before them were the rotting heads of Friends Stanton and Ludwig. Their rotting faces were frozen in agonizing visages of mortal terror. The heat went out of Alma's arm. Her guts revolted and her muscles turned to rubber. Friend Fredus lurched to one side and began choking down vomit. Brother Artis dropped the lantern, which miraculously did not go out. The crossbow hung loosely off of its straps on Friend Sabine's arm. They all turned to the right, facing the direction from which the heads had come. There stood 3 hammer haunts. It should have been impossible, since on all of the 3 faces not even a single trace of flesh remained, and yet somehow the 3 undead regarded them with expressions of malicious amusement, cruel glee, and demonic appetite. By the swords they carried, Alma understood that these brothers had become corrupted long ago, in the days of the old sanctum. Their armor was archaic, but heavier than the 2 they had just defeated. Their bones were blackened with age, and the corrupting red fire burned silently from their skulls. In its steady stream, Alma could almost make out what their faces had looked like. They leered at her with sadistic interest. These demons were easily 10 times faster, tougher, and smarter than the foes the Mechanists had just vanquished. The center haunt raised its sword and pointed its tip at them threateningly. No one moved. "You shouldn't be here. This isn't the old quarter. You should not be here," Alma said to them without speaking.
We are here, heretic. Thou whore in the robes of an apostate. What further harm couldst we do to thee? Thy foundations are defaced already. Thou shalt thirst for the taste of sin. Thou shalt drink deeply of it, and it shall rule over thee. And then, by the hand of thy master, and by thy hand also, the world shall be amazed. Join us. Join us. Join us now.
Alma stumbled backwards and almost lost her balance, but she fought back and righted herself, though her breathing was shallow and her whole body felt numb. The haunt lowered its sword. From within the darkness of empty orbital cavities, pure malice stared straight into her. For another unbearable moment, nothing happened. Then the lead haunt emitted a thunderous, searing, and grinding laugh. That sound dulled swords and drained the body of its vital fluids. The teeth of gears wore down to nothing. Stone crumbled. Love was perverted. Flesh became corpulent. Blood turned to black acid and breathing ceased. Then it was over. The three ancient hammer haunts turned their backs and, one after the other, disappeared into the crypts. The sound of metal against bone grew ever softer. Get out. Get them out of here. Get out. Now, Alma thought. Fall back, Alma muttered faintly. No one reacted. Gretchen and Gorick were feebly trying to help each other up. Manus had just gotten cultist conscious again. Sabine stood motionless, her empty gaze indicating that she'd gone into shock. Alma heard quiet muttering. She turned to the left to see Brother Artis handing Friend Fredis his outer cloak. The young priest bent down to collect the remains of their fallen friends and wrap them in the cloth. Fall back, Alma tried again hoarsely. Now Friend Manus was lumbering along with a punch-drunk cultist in tow. He was limping horribly. Friends Gorick and Gretchen leaned on each other to stay upright. Alma felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to face Friend Sabine. The younger woman grabbed hold of Alma's hand and regarded her with a blank, catatonic stare that was none the less pleading and desperate. Her skin was a sickened grayish yellow. Brother Artis and Friend Fredis stood silently at attention. Everyone was looking at her, waiting for instructions. We won this fight. We won it. Do you understand? We won this fight. We hath destroyed several undead, and though we art injured, we hath survived. I do not know whether or not we shall see those three again. I do not know what evil design compelled them to come here, or why they returned our fallen friends' remains unto us. Yes, they taunted us, but always remember that they thought better of attacking us. Today, the undead have lost some of their number, but we did not. I call that a victory. Our victory. It is enough. We shall fight again another day. That is our duty, and life and even unto death. Let's move out, good Mechanists. Taking Friend Sabine in hand, Alma slowly led the battered party back to the crypt door. Help was waiting for them. Brother Theodoric had led another team down into the basement. Immediately they were swarmed by their fellow friends who took the wounded upstairs. Someone mercifully handed Alma a flask of water, and she drank deeply. Someone else gently collected the crypt door key from Friend Gretchen. "What happened in there?" demanded Brother Theodoric. "Be silent. Have some respect for the dead, Brother Artis commanded in a harsh tone. Catching sight of the grim cloak, Theodoric took several steps backwards. His face was a portrait of astonished revulsion. Alma didn't blame him. A younger child of Caris came waddling down the stairs and approached Brother Artis.
Task at hand. I shall convey thy cloak to the coal fires for disposal of unspecified items. Note on this task directs that the ashes of unspecified items are to be collected, placed in a vessel, and delivered to the main altar.
The younger child reached out to receive the cloak. Artis handed it over, and as the child took the awful sack in its claw-like appendages, the cloak slipped open wide enough to reveal its contents. "Oh dear," Brother Theodoric cried reflexively. Tears were welling up in Brother Artis's eyes.
On malfunction, I have found 2 brothers of Caris. Dangerous conditions.
The younger child was panicking. Override cognitive functions 1 through 10, switch to basal logic circuits, and complete outstanding task at hand as ordered. Accept override code. Theta Artis 675. Brother Artis commanded in a mechanical but labored voice.
Override accepted. Cognitive functions 1 through 10 disabled. Reroute task at hand to basal logic circuits. Initialize task at hand.
The child replied in a flat, emotionless tone. And with that, the blessed and immortal heir of the builder headed off to cremate the partial remains of Stanton and Ludwig. Alma absently released the now empty vessel from her hand and let it fall to the floor. 2 acolytes were working to close the accursed iron door, which had become stuck again. Alma stood in front of it and stared into the darkness.
There is naught which can oppose the power of thy devotion, and even the innocent shall be cast into the burning winds. For such is the sacrifice which thy master demands.
You are intruders here. I command you to depart and not return, lest the wrath of the builder descend upon you and never relent. I am the builder's hand, and I build your retribution. Seal the door, Alma bellowed. As though with superhuman strength, the 2 acolytes slammed the iron door shut, and then one of them hurriedly locked it. Alma could sense that the evil had indeed retreated. Now the job was finished. That door shall never be opened again. A new wall shall be built up in front of it immediately. This accursed sepulchre shall be stricken from the blueprints of this place. It shall be lost to our memory. Alma turned to Brother Theodoric and stared hard into him. To her surprise, the man nodded gently in agreement. "The order is given," he replied softly. Alma turned and moved purposely up the stairs. She desperately needed to get off of her feet before she collapsed in front of everyone. We did triumph over evil tonight. We did well," Friend Fredis said to Brother Artis with rising elation. "You fought well, young man," Brother Artis said, pointing in the direction which Alma had gone. He continued, "Mark her well, for that is what leadership looks like."